So to start off, I just have this photo that I've taken into the edit module here, and I just cropped it. Basically, it's a pretty large photo, and I just kind of cropped out this area in here. And all I'm going to do is I want to add a new layer to this photo, and I want to add just some sort of guy for scale over in this area here. Well, first I got to bring out the tonality in my image. So I'm actually just going to head into tone and color. And for this particular photo, I'm just going to pull back on the contrast. And that's going to reveal a lot of these shadowy areas. And then I'm going to pull up on the midtones a little bit. And then the shadows. And then I'll add a little bit of true black. Maybe a little more. And then let's go in and let's add a little bit of temperature. So now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, just kind of set the basic tonality for this image. Not anything more. Maybe I'll cool it down just a hair. It's a little bit warm. Oops. So is anybody else see the is anyone else not seeing the screen? Just real quick. I know we have a question in the Q&A saying that they can't see the picture. So does anyone else see the actual screen for the ON1 Photo RAW? Screen is fine. Okay. Sorry, Ken. I'm not sure what's going on. Let me know if it continues, and I'll try to figure something out. Okay. Sorry about that, Ken. I'm not sure what's going on with your computer. Hopefully it starts working out. Okay, cool. All right, guys. Thanks so much for answering. Let's get back to the photo here. Okay. All right. So now we've set our basic tone for our shot. And for whatever reason, we want to add in a little bit of life. You know, we want to bring in some different elements onto our shot. Well, it's really easy inside Photo RAW to do that because you have layers integrated inside of your edit module. This allows you to bring in any sort of layer, whether it's a picture, a PNG, whatever file type you have, you can bring it in as a layer, and then you can mask and blend it to create different pictures and visuals on your photo. Another cool thing about layers is that you can organize them really well easily. So if you want to change the name of a layer, just go into your layers pane here and just double click it. And now you can rename that layer. So for example, this photo, I'm just going to rename it base layer. Once I hit enter, now I have my layer renamed. Now this will make it easy for when I go back and I start adding different layers onto this photo, I can tell which layer is which. So now on to adding a layer. To add a layer, it's really easy. All you have to do is click this plus button here. So inside your layers pane, just click this plus button here. This will pull up your ON1 extras, and this is where you can go in and you can start adding different textures, layers, photos, whatever it is onto your photo. So I'm just going to go to my browse, and I made a folder named birds, and I have a little guy standing in there that I want to add onto my shot. So we're just going to add this guy onto our photo here. And what I did there is I added my layer, so I have a new layer on my base layer here, and I'm going to double click that layer, and I'm going to rename it guy. So now inside my layers pane here, I have my base layer, which is our original shot, and then I have my guy layer, which is the person that I want to use for scale. So there's a few different ways that we can grab different tools to modify our shot, but the easiest way is to simply use your keyboard. So I'm going to give you a few keyboard shortcut ways that you're going to be using if you're modifying layers. And one of those is V. V is the move tool in Photo RAW. So if you want to grab your photo and you want to move it around, or you want to rotate it, or you want to flip it, or you want to scale it, all of that is done with hitting V on your keyboard to grab this little move option here. So say you're you're on this layer and you click Z and you have a zoom tool now. If you want to go back and you want to move your layer around or adjust the size of it, just simply hit V on your keyboard. Now you'll notice that I have this layer selected, and there's a couple different ways that I can actually scale or make this image smaller. The first way is just to head up to my top toolbar here, and I can use this scale option, and I can make him a little bit smaller. Or I can simply hold down Shift on my keyboard to maintain the aspect ratio, and then I can just simply drag to scale them as I please. Now I can just click and drag him around, and I can put him over here where I want him. Obviously, it's incredibly big, but we're just kind of setting the base look, so for right now, it's not that big of a deal. And obviously, I want him looking out into this other area, because if he was looking this way, it wouldn't be as interesting. So up in our toolbar here, if we want to flip a layer or we want to rotate it, we can simply head into these tools here. So if I want to click this and I want to flip it, now he's facing the other way and it looks a little bit more natural. Now I'll just make him a little bit smaller. Oops. Maybe about right. Oops. Okay, that looks pretty good right about there. But now if we zoom in, obviously our guy doesn't look very natural. He kind of just looks like he's out of the ordinary because we're not blending him in with the environment at all. Well, if I shot this photo from here, and if I look at my original shot, so if I click my base layer here, and I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, it's a pretty dark shot, and whatever I shot over here is going to be a little bit silhouetted, and it's not going to be as detailed as this guy is here. Well, the great thing about using layers inside Photo RAW is that you can actually mask and blend them individually. So if you want to apply adjustments to specific layers, ON1 Photo RAW allows you the ability to do that. For this base layer, for example, I know I need to darken it up a little bit and make it less of a focal point in my image. So to do that, I'm going to head down into my tone and color, and I'm just going to pull back on the opacity a little bit to darken them up. Add a little bit more contrast, pull back on my midtones and shadows, and then we'll pull back on our true black. So now if we zoom out, it's looking a little bit better, and it's a little more silhouetted. But the thing about this shot is that we shot it with a longer exposure. So we're going to have to soften this guy up quite a bit, because obviously he wasn't standing there for 30 seconds the entire time still as a rock. If he was, then we would have got him perfectly still. But since he's a person and we were shooting this at 30 seconds, obviously there's going to be a little bit of ghosting in this person. So if we want to add ghosting, if we want to add a little movement in our subject area, we can use different filters to do that. I'm going to head and I'm going to add effects here. And let's go and let's add a blur. Oops, not that one. We might have to motion blur. Let's just try a blur filter. Let's just see what a lens blur filter does. So we'll do a lens blur. So now let's zoom out. And now let's pull up on this amount. There we go. It's looking a little bit better that way. So let's zoom in again. Let's make it less blurry. You know what, let's do this. So the reason it's not allowing me to do that is because it's taking all of the information within this layer. So if I zoom in and I add a filter, and I add this blur filter, you'll notice that it's blurring all of the information in the subject here when I need it to blur the entire guy. So what we need to do is we need to actually merge these two layers together so that we can modify this photo differently. Well, an easy way to do that, if you want to keep all of the layers intact that you were already working on, is to right-click and then select New Stamped Layer. Making a new stamped layer is going to duplicate these two layers, and then it's going to merge them together. So this gives you a complete composite image that you can modify, but also allows you to keep these 2 layers so that you can go back and you can play with those also. So now let's say I want to bring in a little bit of blurriness into this guy here. So we're going to add a filter, we're going to add a blur filter, and we're going to add a motion blur filter. And that's what I wanted to apply to this guy, but it's being applied to the entire photo. So what we need to do is we need to invert our mask. To invert your mask, simply head into your filter, and your masking options are going to live in this little rectangle with the circle. Click on it, and then you can head into your masking options, and you can hit invert. Now none of that filter is being applied to my shot. So now let's zoom in real quick here by hitting Z on our keyboard. And I'll grab my masking brush by hitting B on my keyboard. Make it a little bit smaller with my bracket keys. And I'll make sure I'm set to paint in. Now I'm going to go up and I'm actually going to turn my opacity at 100. And I'm going to turn on my perfect brush. And the reason I'm turning on my perfect brush is because I only want to brush in on these dark areas where this person is standing. If I didn't have my perfect brush on, it would just blob on this masking brush right here without actually using any tonal ranges to detect my foreground and background. So now if I click in here, come on, guy. Well, let's do it without the perfect brush and see if that works. There we go. Okay, maybe not use the perfect brush. So now I'm just going to brush this on this person here. And don't worry, I know it's intense, but we can always go back and turn it down. So now we'll turn this blur down quite a bit. So now if we zoom out, and we'll lower the opacity for this. Oops. No, that's actually looking pretty good right there. Okay, so now what we can do is we'll add a filter. We'll add a LUTs filter. And we'll go in and we'll add a nice, boom, iced tea filter. So now if I turn this layer off and I turn this top layer on and off, actually let's reset this bottom layer. Boom. So now if I turn this top layer off, see how much that guy brings in a nice lively element into this photo and adds a ton of scale? So then it gives your viewers kind of a, a placeholder of like, oh, that's my anchor. This is the size of this area. This is what I'm looking at. This allows me to judge the, the depth of where I'm at, kind of the rock size and just the sheer size of all of the, the landscape elements in your photo. So just quickly adding, a person element or some birds just by adding layers really can add a lot to your shot. So that's kind of just a really basic way to elevate a photo. Really just brought in one layer here and then added a LUT filter. So let's go and let's make a new composition. Let's just delete these layers. Okay, so now let's go back into this photo here. And I know a lot of people, when they think about composites or think about layers, they think about using them to make double exposures. And making double exposure photos inside Photo RAW is really easy, especially since we have layers integrated inside of Edit. So if we want to create a double exposure look, we first have to have a photo that has some large tonality in the background or the foreground. More often than not, it's going to be a portrait. People like making double exposures out of portraits because they give your photo a nice creative look. Well, for this image, it works out great because we have this large tonal contrast between our subject and our background. And to create a double exposure with this photo, we're gonna need an image that kind of conveys the same, but it's not a portrait. So for this base layer, I'm just gonna double click it and I'm gonna rename it, portrait. Then I'm gonna add a new layer. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. Now let's go and let's browse. I'll find my birds here. Boom, boom. Okay, really sorry. Okay, so now we've added a new layer, and let's just name this double exposure. And obviously, if we turn this off and on, the photo that's behind it is black and white. So we're gonna have to make this a black and white image. Well, inside Photo RAW, there's a couple different ways you can do that. The first way is to go into your Effects tab. You can add a filter, and you can either add a LUTs, or you can add a black and white. So if you add a LUTs, it's gonna be a lot more of a stylistic black and white, but there's a category for black and white, and there's a bunch of different styles that you can apply. For this photo, I'm just gonna go and I'm gonna add a filter, and I'm just gonna add a black and white. And because we can modify each individual layer, that black and white is only being applied to this top layer, which is our double exposure layer. Well, I want to position this in my image so it looks like I'm blending the two really naturally. So an easy way to do that is to lower the opacity on this first layer. And now I'm going to hit V on my keyboard to grab my move tool. Now I can move this other layer around. And I'm just going to move it over here, kind of right on top of his eyes. Maybe about right there. So now I'm going to bring this to 100%. And I'm going to drop this double exposure layer right below my portrait layer. So now I have my portrait layer on top, and I have it selected so that I'm modifying that portrait layer. Well, to create a double exposure or a quick double exposure, an easy way to do that is to grab your base portrait photo while you have your double exposure layer on the bottom. Click inside this area here, which is your masking options for your layer, and then just go down and select Lumen. And the reason I want to select Lumen is because it's going to create a luminosity mask for me. That means it's going to create a mask based on this dark area in here and the light areas in my sky and in the water. So watch as I turn this layer on and I select Lumen. Now it's saying that this area up here is revealing it because it's the lightest area on my photo. Whereas this area in here is dark, so it's concealing it from my double exposure layer. So now what I want to do is I want to go in and I want to blend this in to this double exposure layer. Well, I can do that really easily by just using my masking brush. So my masking brush is automatically selected for me right now. If it's not selected, you can hit B on your keyboard. And I'm just going to use the bracket keys on my keyboard to make my brush size a bit bigger. And now I'm going to make sure that I'm set to 100% opacity. And now I'm just going to brush out these areas that don't belong in the frame. So now if I turn this off and on, it does a pretty good job of kind of blending this area into the sky area and removing this area from the bottom. Well, we can always go back and we can blend it even more. I'm just kind of setting the base look so we can go in and we can start brushing it in really easily. So now I'm going to blend it by lowering my opacity on my masking brush. So I'm going to head up to my opacity and I'm going to lower it to about, I don't know, about 35, 40. And now I'm just going to kind of start brushing away at the little areas that make my photo look less natural. I can also go in and I can brush in those areas that I want to make it seem more apparent that the person is, the person's face is on these trees. So I can just keep kind of repeating that process by switching between paint out and paint in. and I can kind of bring my photo to life by just bringing in some of these different elements. Maybe a little bit more over here. Okay, so that looks pretty good. If we turn this off and on, oops, we've got an area in here. Let's view this mask. Oh, we got an area in here that we can brush out. Oh, sorry. Let me back up a little bit. So when I turned this layer off and on, I noticed that there was a little change down here in the bottom corner. Well, I'm not sure what that is because it's pretty blended in with my photo. But since I'm masking things away and I'm brushing things out of my mask, a great way to tell how clean your mask is to open up your mask view. And an easy way to do that is to simply head into that layer or filter that you're modifying and just simply hit view. Now this is showing me my mask view for my photo, and I can go up and I can remove these little extra areas really easily. So now I'll view it again. If I turn it off and on, there we go. Maybe I can remove this little area down here. Okay. So now let's say we want to add in another element. Let's say we want to add in some birds to this photo. Well, what I want to do to this photo first is I want to crop it. So to crop this image, I'm just going to hit C on my keyboard to grab my crop tool. And I'm actually going to go in and let's make this, what is it right now? It's about 4x5. That'll work. And let's, how does that look? No, let's do it this way. So I'm just going to bring this up a little bit and in. Oops. And then we'll just center that. Okay. So now let's add a new layer. And I'll just go and I'll grab these birds here. So now I'm going to hit V on my keyboard. And I'm just going to move these birds over into this area over here. So I'll just hold down Shift and I'll make them a bit smaller. That looks pretty good, right? Maybe a little bit smaller. Okay. So now we have some birds over here, but they're pretty prominent in the frame. So let's go up and I'm actually just going to lower the opacity about 15 to 20. So now if we turn these off and on, if I pull them to 100, they're pretty prominent in my frame. So by lowering them, they don't take away from my subject in here, and they're not so distracting when they're on the image. So be careful when you're adding different elements. You can really make it look a lot more natural just by lowering the opacity on some things. Maybe I need to lower it just a little bit. That's probably too much. That's probably good. That blends in with those trees quite nice. So now let's add just a little bit of contrast. And that should be good right there. And let's just lower the saturation just to make sure. Okay, so now we have our birds in there. And to make this look believable, we have to make a reflection on the water. Well, to make a reflection, just make sure that we have this bird layer selected. And I'm just going to double click it to rename. And I'll just rename it birds 1. All right, so we'll just rename it birds sky. And then we'll right click and we can duplicate it just by clicking duplicate layer. So now I'll double click this, and I'll name it birds, oops, birds reflect, oops, sorry guys, it's terrible at typing today. Birds reflect. Oh, okay, we're leaving it. Anyway, so that's birds reflect. And now I can hit V on my keyboard. And I'm grabbing my move tool. And now I can head up here. And if I want to flip it to make it look more natural in the water, I can just hit flip vertically. Now I'll just drag this down, kind of position it so it looks real. Flip it that way. Oops. So maybe about in there. That looks pretty good. So let's just make it a little bit longer here. Oops, come on. There we go. Okay. So now we need to make this look like it's a real reflection. Well, an easy way to do that is just to do the same thing we were doing earlier and playing with the opacity for this photo. So let's go up and let's make it a little bit more little less transparent so that we can see it more, because anytime you have a reflection, the reflection is going to be darker than what's in the top of your photo because it's being reflected on water and it's losing some of its brightness. So let's go up and let's increase the opacity for these birds. Let's go down and let's add a filter, and we'll add that lens blur filter. So now if I go and I'll blur these birds quite a bit. Okay, that looks pretty good like that. But they need a little bit of motion inside of them. So we're going to do the same thing we did earlier, and we're going to brush that on by using a motion blur. So let's go in and let's blend these birds in a little bit more naturally by just brushing. So I'm going to grab my masking brush. I'm going to lower the opacity to about 50. And I'm just going to brush near these birds, not on them. Okay, so now let's go down and let's go up and let's right click on this bird layer, and let's do the same thing we did earlier with the new stamped layer. So I'm just select new stamped layer here. And now we have a entirely new composite image with all of these elements combined. So what I can do is I can right click, or not right click, I can add a filter. I'll add a blur, we'll add motion blur, we'll go in, we'll invert it, and now I'll just go and I'll brush this on. And now if I pull back on the opacity, let's just do radio. There we go. That's what I wanted. And then we can lower the opacity and just keep kind of blending them in. Honestly, they kind of look better just like that. Oh, I see what we're doing. Duh. Sorry, I'm gonna delete this layer and I'm gonna lower the opacity for these birds a little bit more. There we go. So now let's merge this together again, sorry. Now we'll bring in that motion blur. We'll just use that. And then we'll just leave it how it is. That looks pretty legit like that. Okay, so now let's add another filter, and let's just stylize it by using some LUTs. So I'm just gonna LUTs filter here, and the blue actually looks pretty cool. Let's see about some cinematic stuff here. Ooh, I like that a lot. There we go, that's the winner, for sure. So now if we turn this layer off, or these 3 layers in between off, we'll reset this layer properties. If we turn this layer off and on, then we could turn this one off too. You see how easy it was to just bring in some different elements using, you know, a couple different layers on this photo. And then by bringing in a couple different filters, we can modify it and blend it and make it look a lot more like an actual double exposure picture. So I'll just delete all these layers here. And let's go back into browse. And now let's do a quick little sky replacement here. Oops, sorry. Wrong photo. Okay, so let's take this photo in and let's replace this little sky area up here. So I'm just gonna grab my crop tool. We'll do like a 16:9. And let's just bring that down about right there. Boom. So now we have a nicely cropped 6:9 photo. And let's say we want to replace this sky area. Well, let's rename this first layer. Base layer. Now we'll add a new layer. We'll go into our extras. Go in ON1 extras. Backgrounds. And we'll go to skies. And let's just scroll down and I'll find the sky I was looking for. It was this one here. Boom. Okay, so now let's go up and let's scale this down so that it fits on our photo. And let's actually rotate it, or flip it, sorry, so that's opposite. There we go. And the reason I'm doing that is because just by looking at this photo right here, I'm looking at these little clouds down here. And if I pull this up, there's a bunch of those little clouds kind of in this area here. They're a little bit overexposed, but they'd blend nicely with this area on my sky. So just kind of a thing to keep in mind when you are replacing skies is to kind of lower the opacity for that layer and then just pull it over and see if that looks natural. I mean, this one looks pretty natural, you know, if we go in and we blend all these areas. So this might work out. But if you do have a little cloud area, you know, on your sky layer, try to match that up with any cloud areas on your photo if you can. So let's pull up the opacity for that. We'll double click it and we'll rename it sky. Jeez, I cannot type today. Okay, so now let's drag this sky layer down below our base layer. And now what I'm gonna do is, especially if I do it where I have a nice horizon line right here. Oh, actually, let's pull this sky area down a little bit. There we go. Is I'm gonna grab this base layer. I'm gonna make sure my base layer is selected. And then I'm gonna hit B, or not B, I'm gonna hit M on my keyboard. So I'm gonna hit M on my keyboard to grab my masking gradient. So now that I have my masking bug or my masking gradient selected, I'm gonna go up to my preset and I'm gonna choose linear bottom. So now I'll just drop this down. Oh, must have been flipped. Okay, so I want linear top then. And now I'll just match this with a horizon line, and then I'll lower the feathering. Maybe about right. That looks pretty good like that. So now what I want to do is I want to brush in this area right here that's kind of getting removed from my base layer. So I'll hit B on my keyboard, go up, and I'll make sure the feathering's 0. Now I'm going to go up, and right here I'm going to select. Oops. Make sure I'm set to paint in, sorry. So I'm going to select this. I'm going to hold down Shift, and then I'm going to reach across. And see how that used a straight line to brush that area out for me? So all you have to do is click, hold down Shift, and then you can click again, and it will make a straight line for you. So for this photo, if I want to blend it and I want to remove this from this little bridge area here, I'm going to go up and I'm going to make my feathering 100%, and I'm going to make sure I have my perfect brush selected. This is going to detect tonalities in my photo and brush away my foreground and background automatically. So I'm just going to brush this base layer back in by clicking on some of these areas in here. Okay, so now let's go up and we'll make our perfect brush off, and then I'll just lower my opacity, and I'll go in and I'll kind of brush these areas in that are a little bit janky. I'm actually going to go over, oops. Okay, so that looks pretty good. We have our horizon line up here, which is kind of janky, but we're going to fix that in a second. So a good way, if you're replacing a sky layer, and obviously if I turn the sky layer off, or here, let's duplicate this. Let's put this at the bottom, and let's reset it. So now if I turn these two layers off, obviously my sky layer, it's not as blue. There's a huge contrast difference between those two skies. So to make them natural again, I'm gonna have to go in and I'm gonna have to brush on some of the original photo. So let's go up and let's lower our opacity to about maybe 20. And let's make it super big. Well, not that big. And now we'll just brush this on. Oops, jeez. Make sure you have your base layer selected, guys. That's the reason I named it. Sorry about that. Okay, so now let's brush this on and just kind of blend this in. There we go. Do that maybe one more time. There we go. Okay, so now if we want to make this photo look more natural, again, we're going to have to use this same layer and we're going to have to use a reflection. So let's grab our sky layer, we'll duplicate that sky layer, then we'll right click and name it, and we'll name it reflection. sky. Now I'll just drag this above my base layer. I'll hit V on my keyboard to grab my move tool. Then I'll go up and I'll choose flip vertical. Now I'll lower my opacity to about 50, and I'll drag this down, and I'll place it so that it looks natural in my photo. How about something like that? Okay, so now let's go over, and we want to blend this onto our image. So let's use our blending modes here. And I'm just going to use this nice blending mode overlay. And that's just going to basically overlay this photo on top of my image so that it kind of uses it as a blanket, basically. You're basically just laying this transparent, semi-transparent sky layer on top of your bottom layer. And that's why it's blending in nicely with the greens and the blues of the water that's already there. Okay, so now we got to brush this out on areas that we don't want it. Obviously, we want it brushed out of this area here. So let's hit B on our keyboard again. Make sure we're set to 100. Make sure it's set to paint out. And now I'll just brush this off. Oops, probably don't want that much. Definitely want that blue off that bridge though. Now brush this area over here. Now we'll brush, oops. Let's lower the opacity. Now we'll brush out some of these areas where it wouldn't be even realistic. There we go. Let's actually heat this layer up. Okay, so now let's make the opacity a little bit more. A little bit stronger. Okay, now let's add an effect here. And let's add a blur. And I'm actually going to use motion blur. And I'll just lower the opacity. Oops, sorry. Lower the opacity for my layer. And now let's just brush a little bit more of this layer out. Oops, sorry, we're brushing on the blur layer. Make sure we're set to this. There we go. And then let's just brush a little bit of this more on. There we go. Okay. So now let's go in and we'll add one last element to this shot. We're going to add a filter here. Or add a layer, rather. Go to our folders. Navigate to where I had those birds. Open that, and then we'll just add these birds here. Boom. Hit V on my keyboard. I'm going to make them a lot smaller by holding down Shift. And let's just make them fly over this area here. Lower the opacity quite a bit. Let's actually make them a little bit bigger. What do you guys think? Maybe over here? Yeah, that looks probably pretty good. Actually, let's use those other birds. Let's delete this layer. Let's use these birds. There we go. I like these birds because they have the smaller ones for depth, and those other ones just kind of are all the same. Okay, so now let's make this smaller. Maybe set it over a roadway because a lot of birds like playing in the roadway. And let's just put it about right. Maybe right there. There we go. So now let's go in and I'm going to erase these birds that are on Oops. Erase these birds that are on the bridge area. Then I'm hit V, and I'm going to go over to my opacity. I'm going to lower it to about 80%. And then I'm going to duplicate those birds. And I'm going to hit V. I'm going to flip it vertically. Then I'm going to pull it down. Make it a little bit smaller. And then rotate it a little bit. Then I'll go over and I'll use my same options, and I'll use, let's actually not even use that. Let's just lower the opacity. Oh. Let's lower the opacity, and we'll just add a blur. We'll add a lens blur, rather. Yeah, we'll just lower the opacity on these a bit, and then we'll use overlay. Okay. So now let's right-click this. We'll click New Stamped Layer. So now we can go in, and I'll turn all these layers off. And I'll add a filter. Let's add another LUTs filter to stylize it. I know I like using LUTs, but they really bring in a ton of style to your shot. So some of these are pretty intense. I don't need the really intense ones. Let's just use a black and white. Those always look really good. Let's use that. Okay, so now let's add one filter, and let's add a vignette. So now if we turn this top layer off, you'll see how much we've added onto this photo simply by just using a few different layers.